When history speaks of crowns, it often speaks in symbols: gold, authority, legitimacy, rightful rule. But crowns are never born from symbols alone. They are born from action, pressure, and force. In the case of William the Conqueror, the crown of England was not inherited peacefully. It was built, step by step, through war. This story is not about a single battle or a moment of triumph. It is about a long process of violence, occupation, and control that began before William ever crossed the Channel and continued long after he wore the crown. To understand William's reign, we must move away from the image of conquest as an event and begin to see it as a condition, one that reshaped lives across England for decades. For those who lived through it, conquest did not arrive in one day. It arrived slowly, through marching armies, unfamiliar languages, new laws, and the constant presence of soldiers. Power did not announce itself loudly. It settled in quietly and then refused to leave. William's crown rested on that reality. This is a story about how power is created through war, how legitimacy is enforced rather than granted, and how the cost of a crown is almost never paid by the one who wears it. It is a story of command, obedience, resistance, and endurance, seen not from the throne but from the ground beneath it. Before the crown, power, without legitimacy. Before William became King of England, he was already a man shaped by instability and force. His rise began not with certainty but with vulnerability. Born into a position that granted him authority without security, William learned early that power in the medieval world was never guaranteed. It had to be defended constantly, often through violence. As a young ruler in Normandy, William faced repeated challenges to his authority. Rebellions were common. Loyalty was fragile. Nobles tested his strength, not because they hated him personally, but because weakness invited challenge. In this environment, restraint was dangerous. Survival depended on decisive action, and William learned to respond to threats quickly and harshly. War was not an exception in William's early life. It was a tool. Campaigns were used to suppress opposition, to remind rivals of his capacity for violence, and to impose order where loyalty could not be trusted. Over time, William's rule hardened. Authority became inseparable from military strength. Control came not from agreement, but from fear of consequences. This experience shaped how William understood power itself. To rule was not to persuade, but to dominate. Stability did not come from shared belief, but from the knowledge that resistance would be punished. These lessons followed him throughout his life and would later define how England was conquered and governed. By the time William began to look across the Channel toward England, he was not imagining a single battle or a short campaign. He was thinking in terms of control, occupation, and endurance. The crown he sought could not be held by victory alone. It would require sustained force, constant presence, and a willingness to impose authority again and again. England, from William's perspective, was not simply a kingdom to be claimed. It was a territory to be managed through war. And the methods he would later use there were already familiar to him, forged in years of suppressing rebellion and ruling through strength rather than consent. The war behind the crown did not begin in England. It began long before, in the way William learned to rule, to punish, and to survive in a world where power without force meant nothing. The claim that justified a war. Long before the first ship crossed the Channel, the war for England had already begun, not on the battlefield, but in words, promises, and carefully constructed narratives. In medieval Europe, war required justification. Violence without explanation was chaos. Violence framed as duty became authority. William understood this deeply. The claim to the English throne was not only a political argument, it was a tool, a way to transform ambition into legitimacy and invasion into obligation. According to Norman accounts, William believed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the crown years earlier. Whether this promise was clear, conditional, misunderstood, or later exaggerated mattered less than how it was used. What mattered was that it existed as a story that could be told, repeated, and defended. In the medieval world, stories shaped power. A claim did not need to be universally accepted to be useful. It only needed to convince the right people. William's claim was presented to nobles, bishops, and allies as something already decided by fate and tradition, not by force. War, in this version of events, was not an act of aggression. It was an act of restoration. This framing was essential. Raising an army required resources, loyalty, and time. Men did not fight only for pay. They fought because war had been placed within a moral structure. William's claim allowed the coming violence to be seen not as personal ambition, but as rightful correction. The language of justice softened the reality of invasion. Religion played a crucial role in this process. William sought approval from the church, understanding that spiritual authority could legitimize physical force. A blessing from Rome transformed the campaign into something larger than a Norman dispute. It gave the war a sense of inevitability. Opposition could now be framed not just as resistance to William, but as defiance of divine order. This approval did not change what war would look like on the ground. Villages would still burn. Soldiers would still die. Families would still be displaced. But it changed how those outcomes were explained. Violence wrapped in sacred language became acceptable, even necessary. The church did not march with the army, but its approval marched ahead of it. For William, the claim was not a fragile argument to be debated. It was a foundation to build upon. Every challenge to it could be answered with force. Every doubt could be dismissed as ignorance or rebellion. The claim simplified a complex reality into a single truth. England was his by right, and war was the means to enforce that right. Across the Channel, England was not waiting peacefully. Harold Godwinson had taken the throne, crowned quickly, decisively, and with local support. From William's perspective, this was not merely inconvenient. It was an insult. A rejection not only of his claim, but of the entire structure of legitimacy he had constructed around it. This tension mattered deeply. Medieval war was personal, but it was also symbolic. Harold was not just an opponent. He was a challenge to the idea that claims, promises, and authority mattered beyond borders. If William failed to act, his own legitimacy in Normandy would weaken. Power that was not asserted was power that invited challenge. And so, the claim hardened into necessity. What may have begun as ambition became obligation. William could not abandon the war without undermining everything he had built as a ruler. The crown of England was no longer just a prize. It was proof that his understanding of power, rule through force, justified by narrative, was correct. By the time ships were gathered and soldiers assembled, the outcome was already framed. Victory would confirm legitimacy. Defeat would expose it as illusion. There was no middle ground. The claim demanded resolution, and that resolution could only come through war. When William finally looked toward England, he was not preparing for a single battle. He was preparing to test whether stories, faith, and force could reshape an entire kingdom. The crossing of the Channel would not mark the beginning of the war behind the crown. It would mark the moment when justification gave way to occupation, the invasion that did not end at Hastings. When the Norman army finally crossed the Channel in 1066, the invasion of England did not feel sudden to those who planned it. For William, this moment was the result of years of preparation, calculation, and necessity. The ships, the soldiers, the horses, the supplies, none of it suggested a short campaign. This was not a gamble on a single battle. It was the beginning of a sustained effort to impose control over an entire kingdom. The landing itself was careful and deliberate. William chose his ground with caution, securing a position where his army could regroup, build defenses, and wait. This waiting was important. Medieval war was rarely about speed alone. It was about patience, pressure, and positioning. Even before any major engagement, the invasion had already altered the landscape. Foreign soldiers moved through English land, took food, occupied space, and announced a new reality through their presence. The Battle of Hastings, which history often isolates as the decisive moment, was in truth only one part of a much longer process. The fighting itself was brutal, exhausting, and uncertain. It was not a clean clash between two perfectly organized forces. It unfolded over hours of confusion, fear, and improvisation. Victory was not inevitable. It was fragile, contested, and costly. When Harold fell and the English army broke, the battle ended, but the war did not. This distinction is crucial. Hastings removed a king. It did not remove resistance. England did not surrender as a single body. It fractured. Power in medieval societies was local as much as it was royal. Towns, nobles, and regions reacted differently, cautiously testing the strength and intentions of the new invader. William understood this immediately. A battlefield victory meant nothing if it could not be transformed into obedience. His army moved slowly inland, not rushing toward London, but demonstrating force along the way. Villages encountered Norman soldiers not as liberators, but as occupiers. Food was taken, space was controlled. The presence of the army was constant and unavoidable. Fear worked alongside uncertainty. Many English leaders did not yet know whether to resist, submit, or wait. William exploited this hesitation. Castles began to appear, not as symbols but as tools. These were not residences. They were instruments of surveillance, intimidation, and control. Built quickly and placed strategically, they allowed a relatively small invading force to dominate large areas of land. The invasion became something quieter and more persistent than battle. It became occupation. Soldiers settled into camps. Patrols moved through countryside. Authority began to assert itself not through speeches, but through routine. The English population encountered Norman power in daily life, in who demanded food, who enforced order, who punished resistance. London itself did not fall immediately. William advanced cautiously, aware that rushing could expose weakness. He allowed fear and uncertainty to do much of the work for him. When the city finally submitted, it was not because every Englishman accepted Norman rule, but because enough leaders calculated that resistance would bring destruction rather than victory. William's coronation marked a symbolic moment, but symbols did not secure the kingdom. The crown rested on an unstable foundation. Much of England remained unconquered in practice, even if it was claimed in theory. William was king, but his rule existed inside a landscape of tension, resentment, and unresolved resistance. From this point forward, war became permanent. Not in the form of constant large battles, but in the form of repression, punishment, and presence. The Norman army did not leave. It spread. Each step deeper into England revealed the same truth William had learned in Normandy. Authority had to be enforced repeatedly. Victory had to be renewed. Hastings had proven that William could defeat an English army. What followed would test whether he could control an English kingdom. That task would demand more than courage or strategy. It would require systematic violence, patience, and a willingness to reshape society itself. The invasion, then, did not end on the battlefield. It entered homes, fields, and roads. It settled into the rhythm of everyday life. And as resistance slowly reappeared across the country, William's response would reveal the true nature of the war behind the crown: conquest as occupation. After Hastings and the formal coronation, William's war entered its most decisive phase. The conquest of England was no longer about defeating an opposing king. It was about occupying a land that had not asked to be ruled. From this moment on, war became a permanent condition, woven into daily life through soldiers, structures, and fear. Occupation in medieval England did not arrive through sweeping declarations. It arrived through presence. Norman soldiers stayed. They did not return home after victory. They remained in towns, near roads, along rivers and beside fertile land. Their continued presence sent a clear message. Authority was no longer distant. It lived nearby, watched closely, and responded quickly. One of the first tools of occupation was the castle. These were not grand stone fortresses at first, but quickly built wooden structures placed with careful intent. From their elevated positions, Norman forces could see, patrol, and punish. Castles were reminders, not residences. They existed to dominate space and control movement. Every road near a castle belonged to William. For the English population, this changed life immediately. Fields were no longer worked freely. Markets were watched. Travel was uncertain. A soldier's presence turned ordinary acts into risks. Obedience was no longer symbolic. It was enforced daily. Those who resisted discovered quickly that punishment was swift and public. William understood that occupation required repetition. One act of force was never enough. Authority had to be demonstrated again and again. Patrols moved constantly. Soldiers collected food and supplies. Any sign of resistance was met with violence designed to discourage others. The goal was not just submission, but exhaustion. Local leaders were replaced or neutralized. English nobles who resisted were removed, killed, or dispossessed. Their lands were redistributed to Norman followers who owed everything to William. Power shifted slowly but decisively. Authority was no longer rooted in local tradition, but in loyalty to the crown enforced by arms. This transformation was deeply unsettling. England did not experience conquest as a single moment of defeat. It experienced it as a gradual loss of autonomy. Customs changed. Language shifted. Law felt unfamiliar. The people who enforced rules were no longer known or trusted. War followed the population into ordinary routines. Even those who submitted were not safe. Submission did not bring peace, it brought surveillance. Obedience was expected but never fully trusted. The Norman presence assumed potential rebellion everywhere. This suspicion justified constant readiness, constant patrols, constant control. William's rule depended on this atmosphere. Occupation created stability not through agreement, but through fear of consequences. England was not governed lightly, it was held. And holding it required sustained violence, constant resources, and a willingness to treat the country as conquered territory rather than a kingdom at peace. Over time, occupation reshaped England's physical and social landscape. Castles multiplied. Norman names replaced English ones in positions of authority. Land ownership became a reflection of conquest. The war behind the crown did not fade after victory. It settled in and became the foundation of rule. Yet occupation also bred resistance. Quiet at first, fragmented, localized, but persistent. England had not accepted its new ruler. It had merely endured him. And as years passed, that endurance would give way to rebellion, forcing William to reveal how far he was willing to go to preserve the crown he had taken by force. Crushing. Resistance. Resistance did not disappear after occupation began. It simply changed shape. In the years following the conquest, England did not rise as a single body against William. Instead, resistance appeared in fragments, local uprisings, regional defiance, quiet refusals to obey. From William's perspective, these were not political disagreements. They were threats to the entire structure of power he had imposed. The most dangerous aspect of resistance was not its strength, but its persistence. A rebellion in one region encouraged another elsewhere. Even small acts of defiance carried symbolic weight. They suggested that Norman authority was not inevitable, that it could be challenged. William understood this risk clearly. Power, once questioned, had to be reasserted decisively. His response was systematic rather than impulsive. Resistance was met not with negotiation, but with overwhelming force. Armies were sent quickly, often before rebellions could grow. Villages suspected of supporting rebels were punished. Leaders were captured, executed, or stripped of land. The message was deliberate and consistent. Resistance would bring suffering not only to those who led it, but to everyone around them. This approach blurred the line between military action and civilian punishment. War was no longer confined to soldiers. Entire regions felt its pressure. Crops were destroyed. Livestock was seized or killed. Homes were burned. These actions were not accidents of war. They were tools of control, designed to make resistance unsustainable. For the English population, rebellion became a terrible calculation. To resist meant risking not only one's own life, but the survival of family and neighbors. Submission, even if resented, often felt like the only way to endure. William's strategy exploited this fear. Control was achieved not by winning hearts, but by breaking the conditions that made resistance possible. Rebellions in the west and north were particularly troubling for William. Distance from Norman strongholds allowed resistance to linger. Local leaders tested how far they could push back. Each time they did, William responded with greater severity. His campaigns were not rushed, they were deliberate. The goal was not simply to defeat opponents, but to reshape the landscape of defiance itself. Norman soldiers moved through rebellious regions with authority to act broadly. Punishment did not require detailed investigation. Suspicion was enough. This looseness was intentional. It allowed violence to spread faster than organization. Fear traveled ahead of the army, often achieving submission before soldiers arrived. Over time, resistance lost coordination. Leaders were removed. Networks collapsed. What remained was exhaustion. England was not conquered because resistance was weak. It was conquered because resistance became too costly to sustain. William did not eliminate opposition. He made it unbearable. This phase of the conquest revealed the true nature of the war behind the crown. William was not merely defending his rule. He was demonstrating that his authority rested on the ability to inflict lasting harm. The crown did not protect the kingdom. It disciplined it. Yet even this was not the limit of William's response. Crushing resistance through force was effective, but it was not absolute. Certain regions continued to resist quietly, and when patience ran out, William would turn to a form of violence so extensive that it would mark his reign permanently, even in the records of those who supported him. That moment would come in the north, the harrying of the north. The north of England represented something William could not tolerate: distance from control. For years after the conquest, this region remained unstable, resistant, and difficult to dominate. Geography worked against authority. The land was wide, less densely populated, and far from the centers of Norman power. Local leaders resisted openly or quietly. Foreign support, particularly from Scandinavia, threatened to turn the north into a permanent fault line in William's rule. From William's perspective, this was no longer a problem of rebellion. It was a problem of example. As long as the north resisted, the rest of England could imagine resistance as possible. That possibility alone undermined the crown. Authority that could not reach everywhere was authority that could be challenged anywhere. What followed was not a campaign in the traditional sense. It was a policy. The harrying of the north was not aimed at defeating an army. It was aimed at destroying the conditions that allowed life, and therefore resistance, to continue. William's forces moved through the region methodically, not seeking battles, but erasing stability. Villages were burned regardless of their level of involvement. Fields were destroyed, livestock was killed. Food stores were taken or ruined. This was not collateral damage. It was the objective. By removing food, shelter, and resources, the population was pushed into starvation and displacement. Survival itself became uncertain. The violence was sustained over months, not days. Norman soldiers returned repeatedly to the same areas to ensure nothing recovered. Winter made the destruction worse. Without stored food or shelter, entire communities faced famine. Chroniclers, even those sympathetic to William, described the scale of suffering with unease. This was not ordinary warfare. It was systematic devastation. William understood exactly what he was doing. The North was being turned into a warning. The message was clear. Resistance would not simply be punished, it would be erased. By targeting civilians, the policy severed the link between population and rebellion. Without people able to support resistance, resistance itself collapsed. This was power expressed without ambiguity. There was no attempt to justify the destruction through moral language. The justification was effectiveness. The North would not rise again because it could not. Control was achieved not through persuasion or fear alone, but through the removal of alternatives. For the people who lived through it, the harrying was not remembered as a political act. It was remembered as loss, hunger, Death, abandonment. Entire areas were left empty or broken for years. Life did not return quickly. Some places never fully recovered. This moment defined William's reign more clearly than any coronation or battle. It revealed that the crown rested not only on conquest, but on a willingness to use extreme violence when authority was threatened. The war behind the crown was not defensive, it was absolute. Yet even after such devastation, William did not rule comfortably. The destruction of the North secured control, but it did not bring peace. Authority now rested on fear and absence. England was quieter, but it was not reconciled. And so William turned increasingly toward structure, not just to enforce obedience through violence, but to maintain control through systems that could outlast armies. A king, always at war. Even after securing England through conquest, occupation, and administration, William was never truly at peace. His crown did not grant rest. It demanded constant vigilance. The kingdom he ruled had been taken by force, and force remained the invisible structure holding it together. William did not govern a reconciled land. He governed a subdued one. Much of William's reign was spent moving between territories. England was only one part of his dominion. Normandy still required attention, defense, and control. Rival powers watched closely, ready to exploit any sign of weakness. Each absence from England carried risk. Each return required reassurance, presence, and authority. This constant movement reflected a deeper reality. William's power was always conditional. It depended on his ability to respond quickly to threats, real or imagined. Rebellions might no longer rise openly, but dissatisfaction never disappeared. Authority rested on the assumption that the king could act decisively at any moment. War followed William not only geographically but mentally. His decisions were shaped by the memory of resistance and the fear of its return. Governance was cautious, calculated, and often severe. Trust was limited. Loyalty was monitored. Even those closest to power were never entirely safe from suspicion. The burden of rule weighed heavily on the structures William had created. Norman lords competed for favor. Castles required maintenance. Soldiers required payment. Administration demanded constant oversight. The system functioned, but only through effort. Peace was not a natural state. It was enforced. For ordinary people, this meant living under a rule that never relaxed. Taxes, obligations, and legal demands continued. The presence of authority was steady and unyielding. England was no longer a battlefield, but it was never free from the shadow of war. As William aged, the contradictions of his reign became clearer. He had achieved what few had before him, the complete conquest and restructuring of a kingdom. Yet that achievement left little room for ease or confidence. The crown he wore was heavy because it had been built on violence, and violence demands maintenance. William's later years were marked by continued campaigns, disputes, and preparation for conflict. Even in moments of relative calm, war remained the reference point. Decisions were made as if peace were temporary and instability inevitable. In this sense, William never truly stopped fighting. The battlefield changed, but the struggle for control continued. The war behind the crown did not end with victory. It became the foundation of rule itself. And in the final years of William's life, that foundation would reveal its cost, not just to England, but to the king who had built it. The crown and its cost. When William the Conqueror died in 1087, he left behind a kingdom that functioned, but not one that rested. England was governed, taxed, surveyed, and controlled. Castles stood across the land. Norman lords held English soil. The structures of power were firm. By every political measure of the medieval world, William had succeeded. Yet the cost of that success was woven into everything he built. The crown William wore was not the result of acceptance. It was the outcome of endurance, his own, and far more so, the endurance of others. England had been reshaped through violence, fear, and systems designed to prevent forgetting that violence. Peace existed only as the absence of open resistance, not as reconciliation. For the people who lived under his rule, conquest was not a memory tied to 1 year or one battle. It was a condition that stretched across decades. Families adapted to new laws, new languages of power, new obligations. Communities learned silence. Survival replaced loyalty. The war behind the crown followed them long after armies stopped marching. William himself never escaped that war. His authority demanded constant reinforcement. His kingdom required continuous vigilance. Power taken by force could never fully relax. The systems he built were effective precisely because they assumed instability as permanent. In this sense, William's reign reveals something fundamental about medieval power. Kings did not simply rule, they maintained, they guarded, they enforced. The crown was not a reward. It was a responsibility sustained through pressure, fear, and control. History often remembers William as a conqueror, a builder, a founder of institutions. Those things are true, but beneath them lies a quieter truth. His kingdom was shaped not only by victory but by suffering that remained largely unrecorded. The names of battles survived. The names of the displaced rarely did. The war behind the crown was not an episode. It was the structure itself. And understanding William's reign means understanding that medieval conquest was never finished at the moment of victory. It continued in law, land, memory, and silence. This is the reality behind the crown. A kingdom held together not by glory, but by the enduring consequences of war.